Welcome back to week 2 of Anthro 102, Introduction to Cultural Anthropology at Modesto Junior College. It is an online course, and I'm your instructor, Dr. Aviva Sanervo. Um, Congratulations on getting through the first week of content. I'm glad that many of you have done your introductory biography and your course policies quiz, and hopefully gone through the content for week 1. This is the lecture for week 2, and we're going to be talking about ethnography, fieldwork, and ethics. What are the main methods that anthropologists use to go about conducting their research, collecting their data, and then writing up their data, publishing their data. So we're going to keep going over some key terms that we started with last week. So you can see that what we're going to cover today in a bit more detail here on our class outline. We're going to talk about what is cultural relativism and what is its opposite, ethnocentrism. We'll review some key concepts from the end of last week, including emic and etic, defamiliarization, reflexivity, and then we'll get into the specifics of how do anthropologists conduct field work and what is the nature of the ethnographic field? What are the changing dimensions of it, in particular in relation to our sense of authority to speak about our field sites and the places that we are writing about and the people that we're writing about. And we'll also touch on today anthropological ethics. So this week is mainly about methodology, and it will be helpful for you too in doing your own field notes assignment that you'll be doing later on this term. Really briefly, before we get started, I want to make sure you've had a chance to review the key ideas from week 1. It's always a good idea to look back over where we have gone the previous week before you start the new week's content. We discussed what is anthropology, what are its key features, in particular the holistic approach to anthropology, an emphasis on cross-cultural comparison, and an emphasis on leaving home and going to the field to do our research. We also did a quick overview of the different subfields of anthropology, including archaeology, linguistic anthropology, physical or biological anthropology, and cultural anthropology are our focus in this course. We talked about what is culture, what are its traditional traits, and how is it more complex. What are the dimensions of power that go along with culture and contestation that go along with culture? We defined mechanisms of culture change that include diffusion, the interaction between cultures that allows for exchange of ideas and customs. We talked about acculturation, the often enforced change of one culture to become like another. And we also talked about independent innovation, that cultures evolve their own strategies depending on their context. And we talked a bit about the relationship between culture and biology, the importance of avoiding essentialisms, and practicing processes of defamiliarization, reflexivity, and moving back and forth between the emic and the etic point of view. We're going to move on today to build on these key concepts to think about some other major tenets. So anthropologists, when we study people, when we're studying humankind, we point out that it's not enough just to study what people do. What are their practices? What are their behaviors? What are their rituals, right? That's what people do. But it's also important to study what people think and what people say about what they do. So what are the actions, as well as what are the world views or beliefs, as well as what are the discourses, what are the things that people say about what they do. And there's a famous example analyzed by Clifford Geertz, who's a very well-known anthropologist, where he says that there's a big difference between talking about someone winking and talking about someone that has an eye twitch. So just think for a minute. The motion that you see someone doing looks the same, whether they're winking or they have something caught in their eye that they're trying to get out. You know, they're blinking one eye really rapidly, and it looks the same from the outside perspective. Now, Clifford Geertz says that if us as anthropologists, we just write down and then someone winked, we're making assumptions about the meaning of that gesture and that behavior based only on observation. We're not learning anything about it based on talking to those people or trying to understand better the meanings in relation to those people. So if you think about this example, an eye twitch is a biological mechanism. You have something in your eye and you're trying to get it out, so you blink rapidly. Whereas a wink is communicating cultural meaning, and winks can mean different things in different contexts. A wink can be a conspiratorial signal. A wink can be flirtatious. A wink can indicate that you're just joking with someone about something, or you're trying to draw someone's attention to something that's going on. So all these different meanings of a wink, they are important for us to learn about as anthropologists when we're studying that action. The winker communicates something, and that something that's being communicated may be different across different contexts. So what winking means in one cultural setting or one geographic place is different maybe than another. And you have to be careful that you know about those cultural contexts so that the ambiguity of that action becomes clear to the observer. So we don't just assume that an eye twitch is meant to be a wink. Instead, we recognize that all actions are loaded with cultural cues. And it's our job as anthropologists to not just document what people do, but also what people say and think about what they do or what they don't do, right? So getting further information about action. Action alone is not enough. So this example also demonstrates one of our first principles today, which is that of cultural relativism. A good definition for relativism is here on your slide. It's the perspective that practices of culture are natural in their own setting, that all cultures have their own orientation, and what makes sense in that culture will make sense from within that culture, even if it doesn't make sense from outside of the culture. So another classic example would be that of eating bugs. To you, that may sound very distasteful, but it's because you're judging it from your own cultural perspective. In many cultures around the world, bugs are a great source of protein for diets based on environments and based on beliefs. And so eating bugs would be perfectly normal and natural within that cultural setting. So it's very important to recognize that human variation is natural. Diversity amongst human behavior and belief is natural. And so each culture has its own internal logic that makes practices and beliefs work within that culture. And we practice relativism, and here's the second point in this slide, because we want to recognize that diverse practices all have their own value. And so when we practice relativism, especially in contexts that we find confusing or troubling or morally ambiguous, we give the benefit of the doubt that there's some logic and there's some sense that's made of that practice within that context. So as good as anthropologists, we always have to ask, what is going on from within that culture's perspective, this emic insider point of view, not just judging a culture from the outside point of view. So another way to think about this is that there's more than one way to do things. There is more than one cultural solution for a given, let's say, environmental problem or ethical problem. So anthropologists are trying to record the range of human creativity to show that there are these universal capacities to share culture, but that these capacities to create culture can produce different cultural outcomes, different social differences. So everyone has culture, and everyone does culture in their own unique way. This is the basic tenet of cultural relativism. In order to undertake cultural relativism, Anthropologists reject ethnocentrism, which you can think of as relativism's opposite. Ethnocentrism is viewing one's own culture as superior and thereby applying your own cultural values to judge the behaviors and beliefs of people from other cultures. If we think about the root word here, ethno, that's your own culture, centrism, putting your own culture at the center of your worldview, of your sense of values, and judging another culture from that. While we really want to avoid ethnocentrism because it creates stereotypes and stigmas and unreasonable expectations about similarity and difference, we also have to recognize that all humans are ethnocentric to some point, right? We all come from our own cultural perspective, and that's what we know, right? So it actually takes really hard work to be relativistic and to kind of get over oneself and one's own expectations. So ethnocentrism is relativism's opposite, and I hope we could see here that it's really important to be relativistic, to treat other cultures with respect. But relativism also has its own problems and also raises concerns. In particular, it raises concerns vis-a-vis the field of human rights. Human rights is a framework that challenges relativism because it evokes the idea that there's this realm of justice and morality that supersedes individual cultural frameworks. To have a human right means it doesn't matter what culture you're from, that you have this right because you're human, right? So we're going to talk about an example of the interplay between relativism and human rights. And the example we're going to use is that of female genital cutting. And this example comes to us from Sudan and the work of anthropologist Janice Body. But female genital cutting is not just a practice that takes place in Sudan. It's actually very common in lots of parts of Africa. And this practice is used as a rite of passage, which is a special kind of ceremony that initiates girls into adulthood, right? Moves them from one stage of life, their girlhood, to the next, their adulthood. And this practice, which is very common historically across Africa, has resulted in many documented medical complications. It includes pain with childbearing, bladder and colon infections, and it's been critiqued as an anti-feminist and patriarchal process that violates human rights, right? These realms of justice and morality that are supposed to supersede culture. Human rights are invested in individuals and therefore are conceived as inalienable. Inalienable here means that a person cannot be divested from their human rights, no matter where they live or what group they identify with. Okay, so we would, from this perspective of human rights, say female genital cutting is a dangerous practice that should be combated, right, because it hurts women. But Janice Body is an anthropologist who went into Hofriat, Sudan, and recognized that in studying this practice and talking to people in this community about this practice, she documents how this ritual plays an important role in the communities that practice it. For example, female genital cutting is connected with fertility and helps make a girl marriable. So many of the girls that Body spoke to said, I want to have this practice because it's part of what makes me attractive as a woman. Female genital cutting is also used to ensure chastity because female honor is directly linked to family honor in these settings. Body documented that circumcised bodies are described as pure, clean, smooth, and these qualities and being linked to fertility actually give circumcised women higher status in the community. So Body talked to women and men in this community and she determined that women often choose to undertake this act because they view it as symbolic, as assertive of their womanhood, and kind of necessary to the maintenance of their cultural and biological personhood, right? To be a woman in this cultural setting, you needed to have this practice done. So, Body doesn't then say, oh, I advocate for female genital cutting, but she does take this relativistic perspective to say, talking to people about their practices instead of making ethnocentric outside judgments of it based on the medical field or international feminist movements. Relativism can here make genital cutting understandable and makes it maybe logical within its own cultural framework. So it is dangerous medically. Body doesn't dispute that, but it's a practice imbued with cultural meanings. So maybe in understanding this from the relativistic perspective, we can, instead of going in and saying, oh, this is a horrible practice, we can work with communities to develop other important kind of ways that are loaded with cultural meaning to undertake these initiation ceremonies. So it's really important here that cultural relativism does not mean excusing or approving of a behavior. Many anthropologists that take relativistic perspectives aren't saying, oh, but that's what I agree with. They're just saying this is what makes sense within that cultural framework. And often, as I mentioned in last week's lecture, members within a culture don't all have the same perspective. There are certainly many women in parts of Africa working to combat this practice. So members of these groups are working to change these customs, and they realize there are other practices that can help them achieve the same cultural goals. But using cultural relativism in our ethnographic accounts can allow us to shed light on the meanings of a practice and the dimensions of a practice, and also help us work through the complexities that surround us. So in the end, and the complexities that surround this ritual as well. So in the end, cultural relativism allows us to, in turn, make moral assessments, but based on more information. It also doesn't require us to abandon our own values, but allows us to acknowledge complexity. And it helps us avoid making outside or ethnocentric judgments from our own point of view without first talking to the people who have stakes in and participate in the practice in question. So it's really important here to practice relativism, especially in these frameworks where we're anxious about the ethical nature and the moral nature of the practice. So we're going to quickly tie relativism to these concepts we talked about last week in order to think about this through methodology, which is our focus this week. Right? So if we're thinking about coming into new cultural settings that are unfamiliar to us, where we have our own ethnocentric expectations from our own cultural context about what we think is right and wrong, or what we think is good and bad, we need to recognize that part of the process of anthropology is defamiliarization, this practice where you make what's familiar to you feel unfamiliar so that you can look at yourself more critically and so that you can also make the unfamiliar familiar, learn more about the culture that you're studying. So a lot of this is about not just understanding the other culture better, but it's also about understanding your own culture better. Why do we do these particular things in these particular ways? And why do we think they're right and they make sense? Well, because that's how we were raised, and that's our own cultural framework. So this is why we need reflexivity when we're practicing field work, when we're collecting data about other cultures, because we need to recognize that whatever we're thinking about and how we're analyzing it and the expectations we have, as well as the observations we're drawn to make, come from our own positioning and our own experiences. So we need to not just look at it from the outsider etic point of view, but we also need to defamiliarize by trying to look at it from the inside perspective, trying to understand from within the culture's own internal logic. these strategies together allow us to learn things about humanity in general, not just about specific people. So we ask these questions: what makes us the same? What makes us different? Um, how can we recognize that the diversity of humanity is beautiful and is something worth analyzing, studying, and understanding? So these are the basic conceptual foundations that we enter the field with, where we say, okay, we're going to go do anthropological field work. We are therefore going to practice defamiliarization, practice reflexivity, try to look from the inside or outsider point of view, and try to deal with our ethnocentrisms and our biases and our assumptions by being relativistic, while also keeping in mind there are these larger moral debates around human rights. So we've been talking a lot about fieldwork, and it's time to define it again, even though we did discuss it last week as well. So when anthropology was first becoming a discipline around the late 19th century, and we'll talk more about that in our theme next week on the history of anthropology, most scholars were engaging in what we now call armchair anthropology. This was, in short, sitting in your armchair and reading about other cultures, information that had been collected about them by, travelers, missionaries, colonial officials, soldiers, merchants, all these other people that were moving around the world. So anthropology originally came of day in this focus of, okay, I'm going to read about these other cultures and then I'm going to analyze them. I'm going to compare them to one another. And whether this is scholarship or whether this is like lay writing by, all these other peoples, this is often called ethnology. It's cross-cultural research, but it's not really leaving the comfort of your own, in the classic days, your armchair. Nowadays, we'd think of your desk, right? Or your coffee shop table, wherever you do your work, right? In contrast to that, field work, which is a practice that emerged in the early 20th century, with some scholars who we'll talk about next week, who were pioneers for undertaking the fieldwork method. Fieldwork is not ethnology, but it's called ethnography. Okay, so we're going to talk a lot today about what does it mean to do ethnography? What does it mean to do long-time immersive fieldwork? And I mentioned, we're going to have these founding fathers that we talk about next week in the history of anthropology. One of them we're actually going to see a film on today. His name is Bronislaw Malinowski. So you'll see that name again next week. And the film we're going to see today, called Off the Veranda, is all about this movement from the armchair, on the veranda in this case, to going down into the villages and immersing oneself in village life, in the life of the culture of the people around you. So fieldwork can be defined as an extended period of immersive, close involvement with people, and which anthropologists are interested in collecting data from. And immersion here requires not just physical immersion, living with people in their homes, but it also requires linguistic immersion, right, learning the language, and it requires cultural immersion, which means trying to live like the people you're working with. So because fieldwork involves an everyday involvement in the routines of the people that we're working with, it's also been talked about kind of colloquially as deep hanging out. Like what we do as a method is we hang out with people and we integrate ourselves into their lives, but we do it deeply. And the deep here is to say we're doing it analytically, from the observer's point of view, from the anthropologist's point of view, with our theoretical toolkits. So we're not just hanging out just to hang out, we're hanging out for a purpose, to discover meaning. So modern day anthropology always requires some extent of field work. And this goes for both archaeology, if you're like digging in the field, looking for material culture, or culture anthropology, which is living with, hanging out with people who are contemporary, as well as linguistic anthropology, right, collecting language information, and all the various subfields require some dimension of field work. And the term deep hanging out can actually be a little misleading because it makes it sound like we're just kind of playing around when we do our field work. But anthropology actually involves a very rigorous methodology, which builds on this central role of what's called participant observation. And participant observation is defined for you here as the method that one uses to observe the people, to gather information and living closely with them, but also you need to participate in their lives. You can't just take this outsider observational perspective, this etic perspective. You also need to be emic. You need to be an insider. You need to know what it's like to dance that dance or wear those clothes or eat that food or speak that language or practice those beliefs. So participant observation is the cornerstone of anthropological methodology, participating in daily life while also observing it. And participant observation creates knowledge that's both objective, neutral from the outside, as well as subjective, which is experiential. And we'll talk more about this in a second. But in addition to participant observation, anthropologists use a host of other methods, which include interviewing, which include collecting oral histories. And oral histories are basically people's life stories that are told orally and often recorded and analyzed for the dimensions of the story. Anthropologists also collect memorabilia and documents. For example, in doing my research with children in Peru who sell things to tourists, I would collect some of the products they would sell, purchasing it from them, postcards, finger puppets, hats, and sweatshirts, right? Sweaters, rather. And you might also collect documents, from archival materials to legal documents to, documents used in schools, forms that are used. You may undertake surveys. For example, I conducted surveys with tourists to find out what they thought of their interactions with children. You may also draw kinship charts, and we'll talk about this in a few weeks in our lecture on kinship, but kinship charts are basically visual representations of people's family trees. So how are people related to one another? There are other innovative methodologies that could be used. Ethnographers or their informants could produce films or photos or drawings. I had the children I was working with write essays for me. So there's actually a whole host of methodologies, and anthropology takes them from other disciplines quite happily. And other disciplines also take participant observation and interviewing from us as our cornerstone methodology. And participant observation is really what separates anthropology from sociology in terms of methodology, because we are one of the only fields that says that we have to do this immersive kind of field work where you're both inside and outside. And that's pretty unique. A word here about what anthropologists tend to call the people that we work with. So far, I've just been saying the people or the culture. We classically use this word informant, which refers to someone informing on their culture, but of course that has some, permutations to it. And we think of like the Cold War era informants or spies. That's not really the kind of image we want to have. So nowadays we tend to call the people we work with respondents or collaborators, or perhaps the most neutral term is research participants because they're participating in our research. But oftentimes, because we're immersing ourselves in their lives, they also become our friends, or maybe like our pseudo family, our fictive kin. We'll talk about that term in a few weeks too, but fictive kin is basically, giving somebody a name that indicates a biological relationship that may not exist. So for example, some of the children in my field site might call me auntie or godmother, right? So we get to be quite close with these research participants or collaborators. And the term informant is a little unidirectional and unidimensional in terms of who's telling whom something and who's teaching whom something. So I mentioned in the previous slide that participant observation requires this moving back and forth between this eidetic and emic point of view, both participating and observing, right? So the observing piece would be the eidetic outsider perspective. You would use observation to note things as an outsider. And this has been talked about in terms of creating objective knowledge, right? And this is more in line with, classic scientific data collection, that you are neutral in how you collect data. And it is a very positivist approach. Now, positivism is a philosophy from the, 17 1800s, more the 1800s, focused on detached, neutral, objective forms of knowledge, that you really only know what you know based on what you can collect with your eyes, right? Empirical data is another way to think about it. But anthropology also produces subjective knowledge, and this subjective knowledge comes from this emic or insider perspective. The idea that when we participate in something, we're also learning about it through our own experiences. And our experiences aren't just visual, they're also auditory, about what we hear. They're also about what we taste and what we smell and what we touch. So modern day anthropological fieldwork is really interested in you as the anthropologist, and what do you think of it, and how did you experience what you were studying? So that's, again, the importance of reflexivity here for producing this subjective knowledge. And in actuality, anthropology has done a lot to break down the binary between subjective and objective knowledge, recognizing that all data is inherently subjective, right? There is no such thing as studying something neutrally and from a distance, because we're people, and people have their own preconceived biases and notions. The observer chooses what to observe. The observer chooses how to observe it. We choose our topics, we choose our questions, and we choose our methods. And we choose how we write about it, and how we analyze it, and how we share this knowledge. So it's inherently subjective knowledge, all forms of knowledge, not just anthropology, but even science. I mean, think of the scientist in their lab. They're still making choices and decisions. You can't take the human element out of research. So one way to think about this is by considering the cases of classic re-studies in anthropology, right? Classic studies of research that have been studied again by others, because, scientific data is supposed to be replicable, right? If it's good scientific research, you're supposed to be able to replicate the same experience, and if it's true and valid, you'd come to the same conclusions and the same outcomes. But it's not like that with people. I mean, you can ask your dad what his favorite color is, and the next day he'll have changed his mind. People, it's really hard to replicate and create objective knowledge about people. So Bronislaw Malinowski, who's the second name listed here, we're going to see a film about him in a few minutes. He did research in the Trobriand Islands of Papua New Guinea, and he was a man doing research in this place with both men and women. And the research that he did and he gathered was very much based on his role as a man. He really didn't have any access to so-called women's culture, because women in the Trobriand Islands were very private and had their own kinds of spaces where only people in that gender belonged or were appropriate. So years after Bronislaw Malinowski came back from the Trobriand Islands in the 1920s, Annette Weiner went back in the 1980s and 90s to study the Trobriand Islands again. And Annette Weiner said, Malinowski, you missed some important stuff because you were a man, and I'm a woman, and because I have this subjective point of view, see things that are different than what you see. So this restudy example said, Malinowski, you didn't get it wrong, but you just missed a lot. You kind of missed the women's perspective on this. So this is an example of how subjectivity is very important, and it really depends on who the person is, how and what data they collect. Another example comes from another classic anthropologist who we'll talk about in a few weeks, and that's Margaret Mead. And she was a woman, U.S. anthropologist. Malinowski's British. And Margaret Mead did her research in the Pacific island of Samoa. And years later, her research was again in the 20s and 30s, 1920s and 30s. Derek Freeman came back in the 80s, a man, Australian, and did his own restudy. And he claims that the knowledge that Mead produced was inaccurate, and he criticized a lot of her conclusions. But many anthropologists jumped in to defend Mead, saying, again, Freeman is a man and Mead is a woman, so they collected different data, but also that it was a different historical moment. So different things were going on, and it's really hard to study what happened in the past from the perspective of the present. But both of these classic restudies draws our attention to the different kinds of status you have in the field, and the different kinds of access to knowledge you have in the field based on gender, but also based on historical moments and positioning. So we often like to think about anthropology as intersubjective because it's really about the subjectivities of not just the anthropologist, but also the research collaborators, the participants, the people being studied also have a perspective on things that they're sharing. So intersubjective knowledge is created when lots of different people with different ideas kind of meet and bring those ideas together. So, as you've likely deduced, writing is an important part of anthropology. When we're collecting data in the field, we take field notes. And I'm going to be asking you guys to take your own field notes in a few weeks as we get further into the course as one of your final projects. And we'll talk more about that then. But we write field notes in the field to take note of our data, to record our data. And we also produced finished products, which we also call ethnographies. So this term ethnography has been used today in multiple ways. It refers both to the methodology of participant observation, right, that we conduct ethnographic research. We are ethnographers, but we also talk about having ethnographies as books or films. Ethnographies are descriptions of the social behaviors of a group of people or the culture of a group of people. So ethnography is both product and process. It's both the outcome as well as the method used. And it's place specific, it's people specific, and it requires field work. The ethnography that we're going to read together this term is about sex tourism in Bahia, and it's by Erica Williams. So that's the ethnography that I've assigned for you to read, and actually we're going to start reading it now after you finish this week's lectures for week 3. Another word about field notes, and going back again to Clifford Geertz, who gave us the example of the wink versus the blink or the eye twitch. Geertz has this term thick description, and when we take field notes, we don't just describe what we see and hear and taste and experience with all of our senses, but we also provide thick description, which is about the context for the behavior. Thick description allows us to provide interpretation and talk about meaning in addition to just describing. So a description itself alone is not sufficient. We need to attribute meaning to what we describe, the things that people are doing and thinking and saying about what they do. So we have also had some important changes to practices of fieldwork and as well as anthropological theory and method as a result of 2 major changes that have been happening in the last 25 to 30 years, and they are postmodernism and globalization. And Globalization we're probably all familiar with. It involves the speeding up and the compression of space and time, right? Space feels smaller because it doesn't take us so long to get from one side of the world to the other because of innovations in transportation. We also, with globalization, feel more connected because we can email each other and Skype each other and FaceTime each other. And we have all of these technologies that facilitate the ease of communication across distance and mobility or transportation across distance. So that has obviously changed how we think about the field and what it means to go to the field and what it means to be in the field. Where's the field located? But postmodernism may be more unfamiliar to you, so I've defined it a little bit on this slide. Postmodernism is this rejection of modernism. If modernism is detachment and objectivity and the idea that you can have objective and neutral knowledge, postmodernism says actually you can't have any of that. And we've just talked about that a little bit. The postmodern perspective is that everybody has their own subjectivity and it gets influenced in terms of how we do our research. So postmodernism, and this rejection of modernism, has also caused more of a focus on ourselves and reflexivity, who's in the ethnographies, whose voices are heard. Postmodernism causes us to question not just how we conduct field work in terms of who has the power to speak and who is heard, but also the literary techniques used in writing ethnography and the validity of the individual anthropologist's interpretations is put into question. Because if every bit of data is actually an interpretation, then our interpretations as ethnographers may silence the interpretations of our collaborators or our participants, and we can also prioritize one participant over another. So postmodernism causes us to pay more attention to who has the power to do the interpreting and whose voices are being heard. So these two changes in the last 25 to 30 years, 80s and 90s, and into the 2000s, this new millennium, have changed the meaning and location of the field and have also changed our sense of ethnographic authority, the authority that we have to speak about other peoples and other cultures. So one of these shifts, as I've mentioned, is in terms of the meaning and location of what we call the field. And back in the day, it used to be that you had to go to the field by leaving home. And the field was defined as a place that was far away from home. So there were these expectations about the distance and the travel that you had to go through and the difference between the home space and the field space. There were boundaries there. You really couldn't be doing field work at home. And these boundaries have changed a lot because nowadays anthropologists certainly do work at home studying their own people. There was a very classic essay written on taking the subway to the field by an anthropologist who literally lived in one neighborhood of New York and did field work in another neighborhood of New York. And so our stereotypes of distance and travel have changed, and the traditional boundedness of the field as a place separate from home has also been transformed. So these issues of travel, movement, distance has shifted. But as the field has become more fuzzy and it's now harder to define what is the field if it's not just a deserted, well, not deserted because you need people there, but a remote island somewhere or a culture in the rainforest, if it's also, my neighborhood and it's also my school and it's also the bank down the street, as these might be some of the field sites you might choose to research later on this term. As the field becomes more fuzzy in terms of where is it, we also look towards defining the field in terms of things that have less to do with space and more to do with our methods in that space and our attitudes in that space. So we now talk about having a fieldwork habitus, which is a cluster of embodied dispositions and practices that have to do with placing oneself in the field and negotiating how the self is marked in the field. What are the identity politics in the ways that we make ourselves visible or not within our field sites. So then people will say, okay, doing field work is less about where I am and it's about the attitude I have. Am I doing field work? Am I collecting data? Do I have my participant observation hat on? And so that will let me know when I'm doing field work, not necessarily just when I enter or exit the field. But we also have to recognize that doing fieldwork is a disciplinary practice. And I already mentioned that anthropology is unique in that we must do this ethnographic practice that's called fieldwork in order to do anthropology. So fieldwork is seen as a rite of passage for anthropologists. Again, you're going to go through your own rite of passage. It used to be the common standard was you had to spend at least a year immersed in the field in order to have done enough research. But that's been really changing a lot. Now I say I've done 20 months of fieldwork in Peru, and that gives me a certain ethnographic authority about the place, but they haven't been 20 continuous months. 13 of them were continuous, and then the others were summers here and there where I had time in between my teaching commitments. But all new anthropologists need to go to the field for a long extended period of time as part of this rite of passage to become an anthropologist. Again, a rite of passage is a special ritual you go through that moves you from one stage to the next, maybe, novice field worker to expert field worker. So keep in mind that we still get authority from spending a long, deep, immersed amount of time in our field sites. Fieldwork is also now done in more than one field site at a time, and this is called multi-sited fieldwork. And here's a quick definition: ethnographic research on cultural processes not contained by social, ethnic, religious, or national boundaries, but which the ethnographer follows from site to site. Basically, multi-sited fieldwork is recognizing that if you only stay in one place, you might miss things. For example, if you're studying migration, you need to study the community where people are migrating from, as well as the community that people are arriving at. And so maybe you make those connections by following the people. Michelle Bigenho did innovative fieldwork in Bolivia with a 2002 book called Sounding Indigenous: Authenticity in Bolivian Music Performance. And it was all about how identity and music are connected. But what matters in this example is that she was interested in music groups and she followed them as they went on tour. She worked with them in the capital of La Paz. She worked in a nonprofit related to music-related cultural activities. And she worked in 2 different highland Andean communities where music's played. She also traveled to France with these music groups to study their participation in a folk festival, an international folk festival in France. So this is doing multi-sited fieldwork, following the people, the things, the lives, the plots, the metaphors. You would miss something if you just stayed in one spot. Multi-sited fieldwork is also often commonly done in development projects where you need to look at where the donors are, as well as what's happening in the communities where the projects are being implemented, as well as what's happening in the offices for those development agencies, and so forth. So we need to contextualize the place of our field site within the broader tapestry of the other sites it might be interacting with, as well as its place in the world. So even if you don't do self-defined multi-sited fieldwork, you always have this kind of global perspective of why your place matters through perspective and through history. I'll also really quickly mention here virtual fieldwork, which is the fact that the internet is now itself a field site. Some of my students in the past have done fieldwork on, online chat communities. This course website could be a field site. So the internet has been discussed as a spatial non-space. That's kind of a jargony phrase, but basically to say that we are not confined by the limits of space in how we define what is a set of spatial practices that matters. And another great quote to think about this is that the field is now a set of shifting locations rather than bounded sites or bounded fields. The other major change based on globalization and postmodernism is this aforementioned crisis in ethnographic authority. And this is rooted in questions about both writing and representation. So beginning with postmodernism and the turn to including more reflexivity or critical thinking about how we think, how we reflect on our own experiences. Scholars pay attention to ethnography as process methodology, but also as product, this written text. And we realize that methodology isn't just about how we collect our data, it's also about how we record and share it. So our ethnographic authority requires us to recognize that ethnographies don't represent truths. This isn't about an objective representation. It's about what we might call a subjective invention. Another way to think about this, because the word invention makes us think of fiction, and of course, ethnographic writing is not fiction, it's about true peoples and true events, is that ethnography is a partial truth. We are writing from certain positions with particular exclusions and particular silences, and this affects the kind of story that we're able to tell. We also need to pay attention to ethnographic style. We recognize there's a limit to representation, and there are different ways of communicating representation. So anthropologists have traditionally prioritized the visual over other senses, the gaze. And this is a very objectifying move. And in one way, it's a colonizing move, right? You're like the scientist studying the subject, right? And one person is the observer and one person is the subject that's being observed, right? So there's a sense of power dynamics there. So we have to ask these questions about the classic ethnographic gaze and say, what does it mean to look at others? What does it mean to be looked back at? Because, of course, we know in this postmodern day and age that knowledge is intersubjective. People are looking back at us. And how can we move beyond the gaze to think more about embodiment? And embodiment is an attention to our sensory experiences of the field, how our bodies experience the field through not just our gaze, but also through how we talk, how we listen, what we taste, what we smell, all these other senses. So we realize that ethnography is embodied, but it's also affective. It produces emotions within us. We experience things and sentiments by being engaged in this field site. And anthropology is also ethical. And we're going to turn now in our last couple slides to think about ethics. But we need to think about ethnography as affective, ethical, and embodied. We feel it as we experience it, as we think about it and theorize it. And this is all part of the ethnographic project that is anthropology. So this last slide for lecture today is about ethics. Anthropology has always been concerned about ethics. And we need to think about things we need to think about ethics not just in the nature of what we feel good about doing, but also the bureaucratic institution and disciplinization of our ethics. So, for example, all universities, colleges that you do research at have to have human subjects research clearance. You have an institutional review board or an IRB that approves your methods and your strategies for working with people. And this is for all sciences. This is for medicine as well as other hard sciences, other sociology, psychology, all of the above. So part of this ethical protocol is that your people that you're working with have informed consent. And informed consent is that they know they're participating in a research project and they've been informed of its risks and its benefits and that they have a choice. Everybody should have a choice to participate in research. They shouldn't just be, covertly put into a research project and written about. So we always do informed consent. We make sure the people we're working with know we're there and have given us permission to be there and work with them. And we try to, all extent possible, collaborate with them so that you're doing research that is useful to the people you're working with. We also need to think about things like reciprocity. Research can be exploitative if we're just taking from people rather than giving back to them. But different kinds of reciprocity are appropriate in different kinds of sites. So for example, when I'm working with a 4-year-old, would it be appropriate to pay them $10 an hour for hanging out with them? No, that wouldn't be appropriate here, and that wouldn't be appropriate in my field site in Cusco, Peru either. But what would be appropriate is, if they're hungry, buying them a snack, with their parents' permission, or taking them out to lunch if I'm going to interview them. So maybe you give them small gifts or larger gifts. So you have to think about what is appropriate reciprocity, and not all your people in your site will be treated equally in terms of how you reciprocate and thank them for or remunerate them for participating in your research, kind of pay them. Sometimes we do pay our informants explicitly. When I had mothers that I was working with keep data sheets on how much money they spent every day, I paid them for each sheet that they turned in because I recognized that filling out my sheet was taking away from their time to work during the day. So that felt appropriate. But if I was interviewing them and buying them dinner, it didn't feel appropriate to pay them as well. We also need to think about anonymity and the importance of protecting our informants' identities if they would like that to be the case, but also we have a ethical obligation to err on the side of anonymity, even if they don't realize the implications of being known about. This can be for legal or political reasons. This can also just be, about the dynamics within a community. You don't want everybody in the community to know so-and-so said this about them or about some custom or situation. So anonymity is important. We tend to use pseudonyms in our research, unless the person we're working with has explicitly asked us to use their real name for some reason that we can discuss with them. And we pay attention to ethics not just in terms of how we do our research, but also in terms of the power that the knowledge that we create has. Like, what purpose is our work being used for? And this use of anthropological knowledge is really important because, for example, during the Cold War, many anthropologists were viewed with suspicion as being maybe working for the CIA or other institutions of power. This is particularly for American anthropologists. So we have this history of needing to be careful about how our knowledge is used and how we're seen. Why would these strangers be so interested in us? And we'll talk more about this next week, but in the past, anthropological knowledge was used, particularly by colonial officials, to better know and understand and therefore subjugate the colonized peoples under their rule. So we have to be careful with this legacy, and we'll talk more about it next week. There are also imbalances of power that extend from the structured relationship between researcher and the researched. So anthropologists have responded to this to take explicit projects of studying up. Instead of just studying people that are less in power than us or less structurally advantaged than us, we also look critically at institutions of power. So some examples of studying up are, for example, studying Wall Street bankers or bureaucracy or the government. Some anthropologists have even studied granting agencies and corporations. So this is also a question about what kinds of themes and subjects do we prioritize studying. And this was a big movement in the 80s and 90s to start studying up more and start studying structures of power rather than just the marginalized and disenfranchised. Some anthropologists specifically take up activist positions, conducting research they think will bring about changes in the lives of their informants or their research collaborators. They might do this for political reasons, to build alliances, and we often want to choose a project in which the people that you're working with also want something out of it, want something for it. And sometimes we aren't the ones that are best positioned to make these kinds of interventions or do these kinds of studies. So we also have this category of insider anthropologists or indigenous anthropologists. And these are anthropologists that are working at home, working within their own communities. And it's part of the shrinking distance between home and the field, but it's also about shifting power dynamics on a global scale. So the fact that we now have, anthropologists that are from the cultures that were classically studied. It's very important to these shifts in power. Sometimes anthropologists take on more collaborative approaches to writing, actually having co-authors, collaborative ethnographies with the people that you're working with as co-authors. And this brings up questions of voice, whose voice is being prioritized, and how do we work in such a way that we're not claiming to speak for others, which is a bit not politically correct, right? To speak for others suggests that they cannot speak for themselves. So we're looking for overlapping, even contradictory voices, but we're also looking to keep our own authorial voice. So this requires us to include multiple voices and practice polyphony or polyvocality, simply the layering of multiple voices. We also need to pay attention to processes of translation. How does translation happen? And translation doesn't just happen across linguistic registers, but also across cultural contexts, right? So we keep reflexivity in, we include our own selves and our own biases and points of view in our texts as well. So we are one of many voices, but our collaborators, research participants' voices also need to shine through. Finally, it's useful to think about temporality here with ethics. And I have this quote I'd like to share with you. And this anthropologist, his name is James Clifford, and he actually wrote a text called Partial Truths, and he's writing about Clifford Geertz, who we've heard about numerous times today. So James Clifford writing about Clifford Geertz. There's two Cliffords here, but one's the last name and one's the first name. And James Clifford in this text, Partial Truths, is questioning Geertz's thick description. He says, if culture is not an object to be described, neither is it a unified corpus of symbols and meanings that can be definitively interpretive. Culture is contested, temporal, emergent. Representation and explanation, both by insiders and outsiders, is implicated in this emergence. So this quote, and I welcome you to rewind the lecture and hear it again just to let it sink in and think about it for a minute, is pointing out that there's this temporal dimension to ethnography as well as to writing. Ethnography happens through time, and it's a process that involves significant improvisation and temporal situatedness, right? So the moment we're writing about it is different from the moment we collect the data, and there's interpretation happening at each stage and at each level. So we need to consider the temporality dimension there too. And just like James Clifford writes about partial truths, we need to think about the dilemmas of the anthropological project in terms of creating scientific knowledge, right? There's this tension between creating knowledge that's universal and general versus knowledge that's situated and particular. And we're trying to negotiate both. We're trying to say something about humanity and about the world and how the world works and how humans work. But we're also trying to say something particular and situated, something that's methodologically rigorous and teaches us also these broad important things about the world, but that are relevant in local contexts as well as global contexts. So we create these situated knowledges. It's not that we have this irrevocable crisis because of postmodernism and we're just set always looking at ourselves. Instead, we need to remember cultural relativism, and we need to take up these new questions and take on these new topics as we move forward, recognize the shifting power dynamics, the shifting expectations about where the field is and what we can do in those field sites, these shifting expectations about what kind of knowledge we can produce and what is called science and what is called fieldwork, what is called anthropology. So this concludes our lecture on methods and ethics and the processes of fieldwork. What is ethnography as both product, the outcome, the written text, as well as process, the methods we use. And I'd like you now to click on the next module and view the film Off the Veranda. which is focused on Bronislaw Malinowski's major contributions to fieldwork, as well as his central theoretical interests. So the first question here is that I'm asking you to note these. I'm also asking you a few questions about some of his topical interests, in particular the Kula ring, as well as his interest in magic. So please do take notes on these aspects in the film as well, because content from this film will be relevant to this week as well as next week, when we'll talk more about the history of anthropology, and it'll be definitely relevant in the weeks we talk about magic and belief and worldview. So it's been nice hanging with you this week. I hope you've enjoyed this week's lecture,